October 2nd, 2001, Zurich Airport. For the first time in 70 years, every single SwissAir plane sits motionless on the tarmac. No passengers, no crew, no flights. Just hours earlier, this was Switzerland's national pride, the airline so reliable they called it the Flying Bank. Now, $9.2 billion had vanished, 71,000 jobs gone overnight, a country in disbelief as its pride was grounded for all the world to see. This is the story of how an icon of stability, the pride of a nation, flew straight into a perfect storm and vanished from the skies.
Welcome to the Discovery Clock series.
Every great story has a beginning. For SwissAir, that beginning was March 26, 1931. In an act of classic Swiss pragmatism, two small Swiss carriers, Belair and Ad Astra Aero, merged to form a single, stronger national entity. The result was SwissAir. From its inception, its mission was an unspoken one, to be an airborne projection of the Swiss ideal. This ambition was clear by 1932. SwissAir became the first European airline to purchase the revolutionary American Lockheed Orion. This all-metal monoplane was one of the fastest commercial aircraft in the world. On the express route from Zurich to Vienna, it slashed travel time by half, from 5 hours to just 2.5. 2 years later, in 1934, SwissAir made another pioneering move, hiring Nelly Diener, Europe's very first flight attendant. Known as the Angel of the Skies, her role was to provide reassurance and service at a time when flying was still a daunting prospect for many. This cemented a core tenet of the airline's identity. Precision engineering must be paired with human hospitality. After the Second World War, SwissAir, backed by a significant 30% investment from the Swiss government and cantons, was officially designated the national airline. This new status fueled a golden age of expansion. On May 2, 1947, a SwissAir DC-4 embarked on the airline's inaugural transatlantic flight to New York, a journey that took over 20 hours with multiple stops. By 1960, the airline entered the jet age, acquiring French-made Caravels for its European network, and the mighty Douglas DC-8 for non-stop flights across the Atlantic. The service was impeccable, the profits were steady, and the balance sheet was famously solid. Soon the world gave it a nickname that captured this essence perfectly: the Flying Bank. The name was twofold. It reflected the airline's rock-solid financial stability and high liquidity. But it was also literal. As Switzerland's banking industry grew, built on a global reputation for discretion, SwissAir became the trusted carrier for the Swiss National Bank and for its most precious cargo: gold, banknotes, and securities. The airline was, in effect, a flying extension of the Swiss financial system. It was a state-backed national symbol, trusted by governments and revered by passengers. By the late 1980s, SwissAir was an institution, a monument to quality, seemingly as permanent and reliable as the mountains of its homeland. For a system to be considered perfect, it must exist in a stable environment. By the late 1980s, SwissAir was a perfectly calibrated machine, optimized for a world that was about to disappear. For decades, European aviation had operated like a gentleman's club of national flag carriers. Protected routes, controlled fares, and limited competition created a predictable, profitable ecosystem. However, by the early 90s, the rules were rewritten. Spurred by the short-term success of deregulation in the United States, the European Union passed a series of measures, culminating in the Third Package in 1993. This legislation effectively blew the doors off the old system. Any qualified European airline, such as Ryanair and EasyJet, could now fly any route within the EU, at any price the market would allow. The sky was no longer a territory, it was an open battleground between the high-class airlines having to compete against cheap, low-cost carriers. For SwissAir, this presented a unique and dangerous problem. This was compounded by a critical political decision at home a year prior. In 1992, Switzerland voted no to joining the European Economic Area. As a non-EU carrier, SwissAir was now an outsider, forced to watch from the sidelines. Its own partners, Delta and Singapore Airlines, began to question the value of a European partner locked out of the new open market. The pressure to find a way in was immense. An ambitious solution was proposed in 1993, Project Alcazar. It would have been a massive joint venture, merging SwissAir with SAS, KLM and Austrian Airlines to create a new European powerhouse. But it was too good to be true. The project collapsed under the weight of politics and clashing egos, particularly over which US partner, KLM's Northwest or SwissAir's Delta, would anchor the transatlantic routes. The failure was a significant turning point, leaving SwissAir still on the outside, looking in. While SwissAir struggled, the rest of the industry adapted. In this new, hyper-competitive environment, size became the primary tool for survival. The world's legacy airlines began consolidating into 3 global mega-alliances: Star Alliance, oneworld, and SkyTeam. Giants such as Germany's Lufthansa and America's United Airlines forged Star Alliance. In response, their chief rivals, British Airways and American Airlines, created oneworld. Air France and SwissAir's own partner, Delta, would go on to anchor SkyTeam. By sharing routes, flights, and infrastructure, they could offer passengers a seamless journey across the globe, a feat no single airline could achieve on its own anymore. An invitation to SwissAir came from British Airways, asking them if they wanted to join oneworld. But the negotiations were fraught with complexity. SwissAir, fiercely proud of its independence and quality, balked at the idea of becoming a junior partner. Ultimately, the talks collapsed. The choice had been made. SwissAir was on its own. Excluded from the EU market and unable to form alliances with its peers, this led the airline's board to a fateful decision that would seal its fate. If they couldn't join a network, they would have to build one. To do so, they turned to the controversial management consultant firm McKinsey to find a way out of the crisis. Trapped between the new global alliances, SwissAir needed a new strategy for survival. For guidance, they turned to the place many of the world's largest corporations go for answers when they become desperate: the controversial management consultancy, McKinsey & Company. The relationship became incredibly deep. Over the next decade, SwissAir would become McKinsey's largest account in Switzerland, by a wide margin. The logic they proposed, championed by SwissAir's CEO Philippe Bruggesser, was deceptively simple. If SwissAir could not join one of the three great alliances, it would create its own. The airline's parent company, the cash-rich SAIR Group, would act as a hunter, acquiring minority stakes in smaller carriers across Europe. This constellation of airlines, with SwissAir at its core, would form a fourth force, a proprietary network powerful enough to compete against the other three alliances. It was known as the hunter strategy. On paper, the logic was seductive. McKinsey predicted the future of aviation would be dominated by a few network managers who would integrate other airlines into their systems. In their view, SwissAir was perfectly positioned. The plan was presented with overwhelming analysis, but it came with a heavy cost. According to insiders, SwissAir's own strategic function was almost entirely outsourced to the consultants. Their reports were often left unchallenged. Bit by bit, the airline began to lose its own ability to perform strategic thinking. But the problem ran deeper, residing in the very structure of the board that approved this monumental shift. On paper, it was a roll call of the great and good of the Swiss business banking world, including its chairman, Erich Honecker, a former finance minister, and Mario Corti, the respected CFO of Nestlé. However, this prestigious body had two critical structural flaws. First, none of its 9 members had any direct experience in the airline industry. It was a board known more for prestige than expertise, an ornamental body where membership was a pinnacle of one's career, rewarded with perks like unlimited first-class flights. The result? One executive later recalled that during crucial meetings, very, very few questions were asked. Second, and perhaps more dangerously, the lines of governance were blurred. A key promoter of McKinsey's vision on the board was Lucas Mühlemann, the powerful CEO of Credit Suisse and, crucially, a former head of McKinsey's Swiss office. The consulting firm, being paid millions to devise the strategy, was now having its work approved by a board that included one of its own influential former leaders. It was this distinguished but ultimately ineffective board that gave the green light. Not long after, the hunt began in 1997. But there was a fundamental flaw in the strategy's DNA. The targets were not strong, healthy partners. They were the wounded. The first major acquisition was a 49.5% stake in Belgium's national carrier, Sabena, an airline with a notorious history of unprofitability and staggering debt. The pattern continued. Stakes were purchased in Portugal's TP, Poland's LOT, and a disastrous collection of failing French airlines. SwissAir was not forming an alliance of the strong. It was buying a portfolio of Europe's most troubled aviation assets. Because of airline ownership regulations, SwissAir could only purchase minority stakes, often capped at 49%. This created a fatal paradox. SAIR Group was now financially responsible for the colossal losses of these airlines, but had no legal authority to force the deep, painful restructuring they desperately needed. It was a financial black hole. The immense profits from SwissAir's healthy businesses, its world-renowned catering and ground services, were being systematically siphoned off. Billions of Swiss francs were rerouted from profitable operations to plug the hemorrhaging losses of its new, dysfunctional family. The hunter strategy was doing the unthinkable. It was turning the flying bank into a dispenser of cash for failing airlines across the continent. The foundation of SwissAir's stability, its legendary financial prudence, was being eroded from the inside out in pursuit of a vision that was fundamentally disconnected from reality. The company was bleeding, and the world had not yet begun to notice. By the turn of the millennium, the consequences of the hunter strategy could no longer be contained. In April 2001, SwissAir's Group announced a staggering loss of 2.9 billion Swiss francs. The news sent shockwaves throughout the Swiss establishment. The flying bank was, for the first time, publicly revealed to be in a severe financial crisis. The architect of the strategy, Philippe Brugesser, was promptly dismissed. His replacement was Mario Corti, the highly respected chief financial officer of Nestlé. Corti was brought in to perform emergency surgery, but he inherited a crisis that was now not just financial, but intensely political. His most immediate and complex challenge was Sabena. As a majority shareholder, the Belgian government held a powerful card. Switzerland, outside the EU, was in the midst of negotiating crucial bilateral agreements for market access. SwissAir's management, and many in the Swiss media, confirmed that they had received information from someone within the Belgian government that these agreements would be used as leverage to force SwissAir to keep funding Sabena's crippling debt crisis. The threat, as they perceived it, was clear. No new funding for Sabena, no bilateral agreements. It was a claim of political pressure that the Belgian government officially denied, but it transformed the financial crisis into a high-stakes diplomatic standoff. Under immense pressure, Corti worked frantically to find a solution, but the company was fighting a war on two fronts, one for its financial survival, the other in a tense diplomatic conflict where the future of Switzerland's access to the European market was allegedly on the table. Then came a singular event that rendered all previous calculations irrelevant.
And you can see the two towers, a huge explosion now raining debris on all of us. We better get out of the way! Fucking Christ! God!
I hope I live. I hope I live. It's coming down on me. Here it comes. I'm getting behind a car.
After the attacks of September 11, 2001, US airspace was closed for days. Global air travel came to an immediate halt. For SwissAir, the consequences were absolute. The daily revenue from ticket sales, the cash it needed to pay for fuel, landing fees and salaries, disappeared overnight. With its cash reserves already depleted, the company was now burning through what little liquidity it had left at an unsustainable rate. The 9/11 attacks didn't just hurt SwissAir, they drastically eliminated any remaining possibility of a controlled, orderly restructuring. The company was now in a free fall. In the final days of September 2001, the post-9/11 cash crunch had become an acute crisis. The collapse was no longer a question of if, but when. Just 2 weeks ago, on the 3rd of September, Mario Corti appealed to the Swiss federal government for help. He requested an emergency credit line to keep the airline solvent and afloat, but the government refused. Their decision was rooted in a series of hard constraints. First, providing state subsidies to a non-insolvent private company would violate international trade agreements. And second, as a private company, SwissAir was expected to solve its own problems without the help of taxpayer money. The Federal Council reiterated it was confident SwissAir would be able to handle this situation. Fast forward to the 17th of September after 9/11, facing the imminent collapse of the national carrier, the Federal Council reversed its position. They now agreed, in principle, to help. But this was not a blank check. The government attached firm conditions. State aid would only be provided if SwissAir presented a viable, sustainable restructuring plan. Furthermore, they also expected the private sector, namely the banks, to provide the immediate emergency liquidity. The government effectively served the ball to the banks, leveraging their deep involvement in the company to force a move. Not only did powerful figures such as Credit Suisse's CEO sit on the board, but both UBS and Credit Suisse were the primary shareholders in SwissAir Valuable's regional airline, Crossair. The banks were not just observers, they were players. A high-stakes game of financial tennis had begun. This set the stage for the final, tense weekend of September. With the government's aid still locked behind conditions, CEO Mario Corti engaged in desperate last-ditch negotiations with the pillars of Swiss finance, the country's two largest banks at the time, UBS and Credit Suisse, to secure a critical bridge loan. On Monday, October the 1st, the banks delivered their verdict. They refused to provide the emergency credit line needed to keep SwissAir flying. Their decision was based on the result of a severe combination of financial, strategic, and governance failures within SwissAir. First, the sheer weight of the debt was insurmountable. By late 2001, SwissAir Group had accumulated a staggering 17.1 billion Swiss francs in debt, against only 555 million in equity, a clear signal of severe insolvency. To the banks, any further funding was an irresponsible risk to their own shareholders. Second, they saw a fundamental lack of a viable rescue plan. The banks had criticised Mario Corti's leadership for delaying necessary restructuring throughout 2001. They viewed SwissAir's business model and its unsustainable cash burn as fundamentally flawed. In their analysis, the time to save SwissAir had already passed. The group was now beyond rescue. This was compounded by a complete breakdown of trust. Relations between the banks and SwissAir's leadership were described as strained. When the Swiss government refused to guarantee loans until the airline formally declared insolvency, it signalled to the banks that state backing was not forthcoming, making them fatally cautious. The bank's decision on Monday sealed SwissAir's fate. The morning of Tuesday, October 2nd, the airline's cash pool facilities were effectively frozen. The complex global machine of a major airline runs on a constant flow of cash. Without it, the system simply cannot function. The first domino fell at London's Heathrow Airport. Fuel suppliers, unpaid, refused to refuel the aircraft. Air traffic control authorities denied landing rights. The operational network began to seize up. Flights were delayed, then cancelled. At airports from Tokyo to New York, chaos spread among passengers and crew. By mid-afternoon, the official order was given from Zurich. All aircraft were to cease operations. The entire SwissAir fleet was grounded.
Meine Damen und Herren, liebe Fluggästinnen, aus finanziellen Gründen ist die SwissAir nicht mehr in der Lage, ihre Flüge durchzuführen.
En tant que citoyen, j'avais honte. J'avais honte quand on soit arrivé là et qu'une compagnie comme la nôtre puisse disparaître pareillement. En tant que porte-parole, je devais fonctionner et j'ai fonctionné un petit peu avec l'autopilote pendant quelques jours.
The site became a national trauma, a symbol of Swiss precision, now a fleet of useless metal. For many Swiss, it was an unthinkable event that struck at the core of the nation's identity. A day that would forever be known as grounding.
On n'y croit pas, on se dit c'est pas possible. On se doutait que quelque chose allait pas bien, mais non, on n'y croyait pas.
Wir werden wahrscheinlich zu spät ankommen. Wenn überhaupt, ich weiß es nicht.
Wir werden absagen, weil wir können nicht mehr auf Paris-Termine stören, die wir hatten, geschäftlich. Und dann sind wir weiter schauen, wie es geht, ja.
Ich habe eingecheckt, das Gepäck ist bereits unterwegs. Mein Mann hat morgens früh schon die Koffer gebracht und wir warten jetzt geduldig.
Abwarten. Wir können im Moment nicht mehr machen, abwarten, ja. Es sieht nicht schlecht aus, also Wir machen keine anderen Informationen im Moment als einfach warten. Wir können nichts anderes machen.
As Switzerland began to reel in its shock, a new, desperate question began to form in the corridors of power. Could anything be salvaged from the wreckage? The grounding of a national airline was more than a corporate failure. It was a political firestorm. A wave of disbelief across Switzerland quickly turned into a surge of public anger. The fury was directed squarely at the board members of SwissAir's Group, the government, and the banks. Specifically at Philippe Brugesser, Mario Corti, and UBS's chairman, Marcel Ospel, who became, for many, the public face of the decision to let SwissAir fail. In the eyes of the people, the Federal Council and the financial institutions that represented Swiss stability had abandoned the nation's most visible symbol. Under immense political and public pressure, the government and the banks were forced to engineer a solution. The plan was codenamed Project Phoenix. This was not a bailout of the old debt-ridden SwissAir's Group. Instead, it was a salvage operation. After much arm twisting, more than 3 billion Swiss francs was pledged from the government, banks, and private investors. They would finance a new entity, transferring SwissAir's viable assets, its aircraft, its profitable long-haul routes, and thousands of its staff to its healthy regional airline, Crossair. In effect, Crossair was absorbing the functioning parts of SwissAir, while the mountain of debt was left behind to die with the old SwissAir's Group. On March 31st, 2002, the final SwissAir flight landed, quietly ending 71 years of aviation history. The next day, Crossair took over all of SwissAir's valuable assets and was then subsequently restructured and rebranded. A new airline was born, Swiss International Airlines, but the new carrier struggled in a brutal post-9/11 market. In 2005, the final chapter of Swiss independence in the skies was written. The Swiss airline company ended up being acquired by the German airline giant Lufthansa for €310 million. In a turn of sad, profound historical irony, Swiss was integrated into the Star Alliance, the very entity whose formation had triggered SwissAir's crisis a decade earlier. 2 years later, in 2007, the entire management board of SwissAir, including the last CEO, Mario Corti, and third parties involved in SwissAir's demise, stood accused in the court district of Bulach. The charges were severe: mismanagement, making false statements about the company's finances, and damaging creditors. For months, the whole country watched as prosecutors attempted to prove that the collapse was not just a failure, but a crime. However, the verdict, when it was announced, was an even greater shock than the grounding itself. All 19 defendants were acquitted of all major charges. The court concluded that while catastrophic misjudgments had been made, there was insufficient evidence of deliberate criminal intent. To the Swiss public, the verdict was incomprehensible. It fueled a narrative of a two-tier justice system, where the corporate elite who had overseen a national disaster could walk away without consequence. The trial, meant to bring closure, only deepened the national wound and brought distrust particularly towards the financial and governmental institutions. To this day, Mario Corti maintains that the grounding was not inevitable. He argues that had the banks and the government provided the emergency funds on that fateful weekend, the airline could have been saved. History, however, would offer its own, deeply ironic, verdict on the matter. This success stands in stark contrast to the fate of the institutions that sealed SwissAir's doom. UBS and Credit Suisse had refused to help, citing SwissAir's reckless financial strategies as an unacceptable risk. 7 years later, during the 2008 global financial crisis, those same banks, having pursued their own high-risk strategies, stood on the brink of collapse. They were saved only by a massive bailout, funded by the very same Swiss taxpayers who had watched their airline fall. In the end, the story of SwissAir is one of an airline that was pulled down at every level. SwissAir, a national icon, failed by the very people who were piloting it, from a board that lacked experience, to consultants who outsourced its thinking, to CEOs whose greed flew them too close to the ground. But for the Swiss people, the memory is less about a balance sheet. It was a symbol of a nation's character, flown proudly across the globe. And it is this memory of excellence of a time when the white cross on the red tail represented the very best of a country that is still cherished today. Hello everyone, I wanted to thank you for watching this video and for your continuous support of this channel. Many, many thanks, and see you in the next one.